right. May have some folks trickling in for the next few minutes. That's okay. We can manage here. So I think Dr. Dickinson forgot to mention, but we're trying something a little bit new this year. So there are 3 talks going concurrently in each time slot. And this year, it's the case that for each time slot, 2 of the talks are kind of more of a readily accessible, perhaps a beginner's level talk. But in each time slot, 1 of the talks is going to be an advanced track. So for good or ill, you all are in the advanced track now. So buckle up. So, okay, so I am assigned to talk about the topic, why Christian physicalism is a bad idea. And it turned out to be arranged pretty nicely with Nancy's talk, because she sort of talked about some soul-body stuff. So I'm going to dive in. The definition of Chalcedon enjoins Christians to confess that Jesus Christ is, quote, perfect in deity and humanness, that he is, quote, actually God and actually man, with a rational soul and a body, that he's of the same reality as we ourselves as far as his humanness is concerned, and thus, like us in all respects, sin only excepted. So such a confession sort of intertwines some subtle but important Christological and anthropological questions. So we're prompted to consider, for example, questions like involving the nature of the incarnation, as well as the death and resurrection of Christ. But those issues can't be isolated from anthropology questions along the lines of what does it mean to be a human being? What is a human? Is a human a soul? Is a human a soul and a body, or just simply a body with a brain, no soul involved? So regarding the composition of human beings, most thinkers, and this is Christians and non-Christians alike, traditionally have held that a human person is a unity of 2 distinct entities. One, the physical, that's your body, as well as one immaterial element, your soul. And it's generally acknowledged that the historic position of Christendom is some sort of dualism. It's a word I'm going to use a lot. Dualism, that is a view along the lines of this, that human persons are composites of body and soul, such that it's possible for you to survive separation from your body. And so, church father, the early believer, St. Augustine says, quote, "The soul is united to the body in the unity of the person, for if the soul is not mistaken about its nature, it grasps that it is incorporeal." And so it must necessarily be allowed that the principle of intellectual operation, agrees the medieval father Aquinas, which we call the soul of a man, is a principle both incorporeal and subsistent. And so just one more quote from the history of the church. I'm afraid you've got to be brave and come all the way to the front now. The Westminster Confession of Faith from the mid-1600s distinguishes sharply between body and soul. It says, quote, "The bodies of men after death return to dust and see corruption, but their souls, which neither die nor sleep, immediately return to God who gave them. The souls of the righteous are received in the highest heavens, where they behold the face of God in light and glory, waiting for the full redemption of their bodies. And the souls of the wicked are cast into hell, where they remain, reserved to the judgment of the great day. Besides these 2 places for souls separated from their bodies, the Scripture acknowledgeth none." So whether it's because it's taken as the straightforward teaching of Scripture, as being entailed by doctrinal commitments in the Christian tradition, or just simply as the straightforward common sense view of one's sort of irreducible first-person point of view, soul-body dualism remains the prevailing view in the Christian tradition. And yet dualism, interestingly, is being rejected in the unlikeliest of places by Christian scholars. So a growing number of Christian scholars, including theologians, exegetes, philosophers, the group is collectively referred to as Christian physicalists. They are adopting the claim that humans are wholly physical beings. So although they do retain the belief that God is an immaterial being, non-physical, Christian physicalists argue that human beings neither possess nor are identical to non-physical souls. So the question before us that I want to put before you is this: is such a position viable as a distinctly Christian anthropology? And to answer that, we'll start by talking a little bit about the tough notion of physicalism generally, and then I'll focus in on its expression amongst Christian physicalists in particular, and then I'm ultimately going to argue that it fails as a Christian anthropology because it cannot account for certain fundamental Christian tenets. So, for this reason, Christian physicalism is, I think, a bad idea and should be rejected by Christians. Okay, so the term physicalism is a little bit of a slippery term. Kind of means different things depending on your context. It sometimes refers to the idea that there is no entity at all in existence, which is not a purely physical entity. But our interest, though, is with physicalism intended as a certain ontology of human persons, including their consciousness. So against the backdrop of naturalism's really rise in prestige in the 20th century, the 20th century saw dualism increasingly replaced by views of human persons as wholly physical. And this trend has sort of found its stride in the present century as physical science increasingly is regarded as kind of trumping other disciplines in the search for knowledge. This is particularly evident, for example, in the influence exerted now by the neuroscientific field. These are claims to the effect that functions and features of human persons, the functions and features of human persons that were traditionally attributed to your non-physical soul are normally now by neuroscientists said to be explainable entirely in terms of your physical brain or your body. So as Nancy Murphy, just a quick note, Nancy Murphy is a Christian physicalist. Nancy Pearcey is not. She's our keynote speaker. If I accidentally say Nancy Pearcey, do not tell her, okay? Because I always mean Nancy Murphy. We're just going to stipulate that right now. Nancy Murphy is a Christian theologian at Fuller Theological Seminary in California, and she writes, quote, "Science has provided a massive amount of evidence suggesting that we need not postulate the existence of an entity such as a soul or mind in order to explain life and consciousness." Something of an unexpected claim, perhaps, from a theologian. Therefore, in Murphy's estimation, she continues, quote, "All of the functions once attributed to the soul, perception, reason, emotion, moral awareness, even religious experience," she says, "these are yielding to brain studies." Daniel Dennett, and this is a guy with no interest in theology in any sense, is forthright about this same point. He says, "This fundamentally anti-scientific stance of dualism," he says, "is, to my mind, its most disqualifying feature, and is the reason why I adopt the apparently dogmatic rule that dualism is to be avoided at all costs. It is not that I think I can give a knockdown proof that dualism in all its forms is false or incoherent, but that, given the way dualism wallows in mystery, accepting dualism is giving up." So while the truth of these claims, I think, is rather dubious, they do reveal the perception that neuroscience has displaced belief in the soul in favor of physicalism. So let's just survey the physicalist landscape for a minute and get two big categories in front of ourselves. So while all physicalists agree in denying that human persons are or have substantial immaterial souls, it's far trickier to find a widely accepted or widely satisfactory articulation of just what is physicalism. It's a tough term to get a hold of. But for our purposes, fortunately, I think we can grab up a working example. So we can point to some paradigm cases of physical objects, things like rocks or atoms, and we'll just say that being physical is being like one of these, things. So we're going to adopt this working definition. Physicalism is the thesis that all features and functions, whether they be mental or physical or spiritual, all these elements of human beings can be fully accounted for in terms of the physical, or if you like, the microphysical. And this, of course, will spell the wholesale rejection of dualism. So broadly speaking, physicalist views break down into two categories. On the one hand, there are reductive versions, and then on the other hand, non-reductive. So reductive and then non-reductive versions of physicalism. So the former, also sometimes referred to as identity theory, is best understood as claiming that mental states, and what I mean by mental states here, I'm thinking about states such as being in pain, or intending to do my homework, or being convinced that Samwise is the real hero, because that's true. These things, they say, are identical to or perhaps reduced to brain states or brain processes. In other words, the reductive side, reductionists, tend to hold that talk of mental states or psychological states will eventually reduce to talk of physics. And so Paul Churchland, a very famous defender of this view, says, quote, "The red surface of an apple does not look like a matrix of molecules reflecting photons at certain critical wavelengths, but that is what it is. The sound of a flute does not sound like a sinusoidal compression wave train in the atmosphere, but that is what it is. The warmth of the summer air does not feel like the mean kinetic energy of millions of tiny molecules, but that is what it is. If one's pains and hopes and beliefs do not introspectively seem like electrochemical states in a neural network," he continues, "that may be only because our faculty of introspection, like our other senses, is not sufficiently penetrating to reveal such details." And so this is the case, he says, despite the appearance that some mental states sort of transcend or, he says, break free of the physical. But if we can gain exhaustive knowledge of Paul's physical properties, then we shall have everything we need in order to have exhaustive knowledge of Paul's mental properties. That's his idea. So to be clear, there are lots of disagreements amongst reductive physicalists, including things like, for example, whether or not mental states should or even can be reduced to behaviors, whether every type of mental state can be identified with some type of brain state. And here I'll give you a quick side lesson. This part's for free. I'm going to use the words type and the token a few times here, so you may want to jot this down. Philosophers distinguish between general sorts of things, we call these types, and on the other hand, the other side of the distinction is particular concrete instances of those types. So for example, here'd be like, there's a type of thing called a baseball game, and there is a token of baseball games like Game 7 of the World Series a few years ago, something like that. So Christian physicalists overwhelmingly have rejected the reductive version of physicalism. Good for them too, I say. And they've done this for various reasons. Nancy Murphy writes that she rejects the contemporary philosophical view that says the person is nothing but a body, and she desires instead to explain how we can claim that we are our bodies, yet without denying the higher capacities that we think of as being essential for our humanness. And what are those? Well, she says these include things like rationality, emotion, morality, free will, and she says most importantly the capacity to be in relationship with God. So that's terrific. I think any Christian worth their salt should want to be able to find an explanation for these real features. So Murphy's desire here is well placed, because even a minimalist Christian has to be able to explain those things. I mean, think about it. Even a minimalist Christian understanding has to be able to explain our capacity to accept the gospel freely, to ask for forgiveness for our sins and so forth. We must freely believe that Jesus truly is God, these sort of things. And so Christian physicalists, I think, are doubtlessly keen to avoid the hard problem of explaining the qualia, that is the what it is like texture that being alive has, especially in our conscious experience. And so the idea here is that when I have a certain experience, like a few months ago, the experience of watching my son Ian take his first step, say, in this case, there is a subjective quality to my experience that none of you could possibly access. You could do something that's pretty good, that is, remember what it's like for you to watch your kid take his or her first steps and think, my experience is probably similar to yours. But no, that's not the same as your knowing what my experience, what the qualia of my experience is like. Any third-person observer could, regard me and note the proud Papa expression on my face, and you can try to infer from that what my experience of seeing it as the dad is like, but you can't arrive there. Does that make sense? It's also partially because my kid's so much better, but it's... Okay, so the concern to preserve a meaningful distinction between non-physical mental states and physical properties, especially the brain, is one that's widely shared amongst Christian physicalists, and I'm happy about that. And indeed, it's largely the attempt to address that concern that motivates their rejection of the reductive version in favor of non-reductive version. Okay, so whereas all the reductive physicalists insist that all of our mental states are either identical to or reduced to brain states or brain processes, non-reductive physicalists want to preserve mental states as real features, or perhaps you might want to say properties or functions of human persons that do not reduce to ontologically anything physical. So as one proponent of this view, a fellow named Kevin Corcoran, he puts it this way, quote, "If something does not so much as have a capacity for intentional states, it seems equally obvious that that thing is not a candidate for personhood." So if a being lacks a capacity for intentional states, then that being, whatever it is not a person. I agree. I think that's terrific. So it therefore is not the case on this view that Paul's being in love is ontologically identical to any sort of electrochemical brain property within Paul's brain. Although it is the case that Paul's mental state of being in love reduces on this view to some token physical state, maybe some arrangement or relations between Paul's various physical properties. So, in short, that was a lot really quick. So in short, most non-reductive physicalists hold that specific types of mental states do not generally reduce to specific types of physical states, although every token mental state is thought to reduce to some token physical state. I think a significant motivation here for this position is the desire to deny that all of our experience of things like being in pain or being super duper happy are reducible to a specific psychochemical brain state, and I think that's the idea here. So it seems that, so it's given an illustration that it can be the case that Paul is in pain, and it can be the case that Paul's dog Rover is in pain. So they can have, both of them have the same type of experience, but plainly they are not experiencing the same type of psychochemical brain state. I mean, good grief. Dog brains are just not the same as human brains, and I hope that's clear to us. So there's considerable variety among non-reductive physicalists when it comes to specifying just exactly what it is, the relationship between Paul's so-called mental state and his physical state, but we're going to have to set that aside for now. Okay, so now we've got a rough and ready distinction before us about the different kinds of physicalism. We see the Christian physicalists are really only keen to be on board with the non-reductive version, so let's talk about the Christian physicalist. Now, Christian physicalism is not to be understood as a third alternative. It's not like there's reductive, non-reductive, and then Christian physicalisms. It's not a third category. It's a particular coupling of some version of non-reductive physicalism with Christian doctrine. It's an attempt to make that conjunction. Maybe it'd be helpful to think of Christian physicalism as sort of a family of views that all agree that there can be a coupling between non-reductive physicalism and Christian doctrine, but they just don't all couple them up the same way. So he doesn't talk about this Christian physicalism label, but there's a famous New Testament scholar named Joel Green who expresses this commitment this way. He says, various forms of monism, monism is the basic idea that there's only one kind of stuff in existence. He says, various forms of monism defended among Christians require no second or metaphysical entity, such as a soul or spirit, to account for human capacities and distinctives, while insisting that human behavior cannot be explained exhaustively with recourse to genetics or neuroscience. So he continues, using various models, the monists with whom I'm concerned argue that the phenomenological experiences that we label soul are neither reducible to brain activity nor evidence of a substantial ontological entity such as a soul, but rather represent essential aspects or capacities of the self, where, to be clear, whatever the self is, it's not a immaterial soul distinct from your body on his view. So we're gonna talk about only the two main contenders, the two most popular kids at school in the Christian physicalist camp right now: the Constitution view, I'll call them constitutionalist, and the animalist view, So there's a number of ontologies of human persons that are championed in the Christian physicalist camp, but these two currently stand out as the dominant players. It's important to note that neither of these is a distinctly Christian ontology of persons per se, because in the constitutionalist camp, there are plenty of constitutionalists who don't care a straw about Christianity, and there are plenty animalists, like Eric Olson, who are not religious at all. So the situation is that these Christian scholars have just been attracted to views that are also held by non-Christians, and that's fine. So amongst adherents of the Constitution view or constitutionalism, the work of a recently deceased philosopher named Lynn Rudder Baker has clearly outstripped the work of her companions. We're going to focus on her. Baker says that, quote, "What we now know about nature renders untenable the idea of a human person as consisting, even in part, of an immaterial soul." Think about that. Baker argues in her hugely influential book, Persons and Bodies, A Constitution View, that one is a human in virtue of being constituted by a human body, and one is a person in virtue, essentially, of having the capacity for a first-person perspective. So in short, human persons are constituted by their physical bodies, but they nevertheless are not identical to them. So what do constitutionalists mean when they talk about the first-person perspective? Well, Baker explains it this way. She says the first-person perspective is a very peculiar thing, a very, very peculiar ability that all and only persons have. It's the ability to think of oneself without the use of any name, description, or demonstrative. It's the ability to conceive of oneself as oneself from the inside, as it were. So apparently she does not have in mind that this is a mental state, but it's also not a mere sort of point of view, because even Fido the dog has a point of view, so apparently she doesn't mean it's just that. But it seems to be that she thinks of it as a certain capacity, namely the capacity that you have to think of yourself as yourself. So on the Constitution view, this capacity to conceive of yourself as yourself is sufficient for making you a person. So being a person is not a matter of being made out of a certain type of stuff. She doesn't think that. It's not a matter of having any certain type of body. It's more that in the case of persons and bodies, if every property had by someone is had by the other, but if all the properties that you have are had by your body, then the English words person and body they refer to the same thing, like Clark Kent and Superman, as Kevin Corcoran uses that illustration. But if either you or your body lacks a property that the other has, then you're not identical. Okay. So on the Constitution view, there has to be at least one property that you have that your body doesn't have to preserve the distinction here. And as Lynn Baker continues, she correctly observes this, that a molecule-for-molecule qualitative duplicative view would not be you. It would not have your first-person perspective. It'd probably creep the heck out of you, but it wouldn't be you. This thing would start out with a first-person perspective that was qualitatively just like yours, but the qualitative indistinguishability would be short-lived because shortly you and your duplicate would enter a room from different perspectives, of course. And so far as she describes her view there's a whole lot that a dualist can get on board with. I quite agree with what she said in the quote we just heard. But what makes the Constitution view a physicalist view is its claim that you are a human in virtue of being constituted by, and that's a key phrase, being constituted by a human body. So let's talk about what constitution is. Constitution, that word is a relational term. It picks out a certain relationship. So what does it mean to be constituted by something? Let me explain it by an example. From the perspective I have when I'm sitting at my desk, there's a foot-tall bust of Shakespeare on my bookcase. So when we think about the plaster statuette of Shakespeare that's before my desk, Baker and Corcoran will want to distinguish between the statuette and the plaster that it's made of on the grounds that, although they are co-spatial, they exist in the same space, they're not identical. So they want us to think about something like this. If we place my lovely Shakespeare statuette in a sealed container and crushed it into 1,000 pieces, then the statuette of Shakespeare would be completely destroyed. But the plaster would still be there. So the idea is that just because the plaster constitutes the Shakespeare statuette, the plaster itself is nevertheless neither a part of nor identical to the Shakespeare statuette. Does that make sense? Because the Shakespeare statuette, will be destroyed, but the plaster will remain. So Christian physicalists who are constitutionalists understand the relation between the physical body that constitutes a human, that constitutes me, and the human person that is me, in a way similar to how the plaster relates to my Shakespeare statuette. Although the statuette of Shakespeare is not, of course, a human person, it's a similar relation. So, the statuette of Shakespeare weighs, about 3 pounds, and it stands in a constituted by relationship to, a 3-pound lump of plaster. I guess the person that is me is constituted by a body that is 6 feet 4 inches tall, ridiculously handsome, bald, etc. It's normal stuff. Okay, so in this view, once again, the physical body that constitutes me and the human person that is me are not identical, and that's not least because the body that constitutes me does not have my first-person perspective. That's their view. So animalism, talk about animalism for a moment here. This is the other version of Christian physicalism that's really, really popular currently. Among its best-known components are hugely terrific philosophers like Peter Van Inwagen, Notre Dame, Trenton Merrick's at the University of Virginia. So for their part, animalists reject the Constitution view's underlying account of a material constitution, and they instead think that a person just is a human organism. So animalism says, quote, each of us is numerically identical with an animal. There is a certain organism, and you and it are one and the same thing. So the idea is that a person is numerically identical, one and the same thing as an animal of the human kind. That's the animalism idea. So when we're trying to differentiate animalism and the Constitution view, it'd be helpful, I think, to think about something like this. What are the persistence conditions? Philosophers love talking about these. What are the persistence conditions on each of these views? What is it that it accounts for a thing A in 2000 being identical to the thing A in 2018? And I dare say many of you fit the conditions for A here. So this highlights an important point of departure between these two views. When we contemplate the notion of personal identity, the question, something like, in virtue of what may we assert that the Keith who is typing this article in, what month is this? March. It's been a long semester, gang, okay? March of 2018. In virtue of what is that Keith, identical to the Keith who was married 13 or 14 years, long time ago in 2004. What are the conditions, in other words, which must be met in order to explain the persistence of Keith's identity through this, over the course of these years? So how is this possible? The answer to, however you answer this, is going to be your answer to what are the persistence conditions of Keith. So on the Constitution view, it was understood that your physical body or your physical organism or your living animal that constitutes me and the human person that is me are related in a way similar to how the plaster relates to the statuette. Animalists totally reject that. On the Constitution view, I shall continue in existence just so long as my first-person perspective is exemplified or continues. Animalists, on the other hand, will insist that my persistence conditions are entirely a biological matter. It's entirely physical. It's not possible in this view for a human person to exist without his or her physical body. Your physical body dies, you're done. Okay, so focusing on its claim of biological continuity, I think, will allow us to sort of pinpoint an important feature of the animalist view. In the animalist view, what is it that makes one human organism the same human organism at a later time? Well, it cannot be something like the physical stuff comprising the organism, and I bet you can think quickly about why that is, because as gross as it is, we're doing a pretty bang-up job of trading molecules in this room. You know, skin cells flaking off and being breathed in by your neighbor. It's a delightful thing. So that can't be it, because then all the people who entered this room cease to exist and a whole new set of people are going to exit the room. But that seems like a bit of a stretch. Your spouses expect you, not something similar to you, to come home. So maybe in response, animalists could just point to some kind of, and this is what they typically do, they'll say, no, it's not that way. It's that there's this ongoing, underlying biophysical process that goes on continually, and they call this process simply life with a capital L. It's the persistence of this process, it is claimed. It's as long as that process continues, that's what does the trick. How can we define life? Animalists will say that life is the self-organizing biological process or event that maintains an organism's complex internal structure. And that structure is complicated because it's continually having to take in and assimilate, you know, the food you eat, the molecules, etc., that you inherit from your neighbor, has to account for the loss of these things, biological processes. So in this view, in other words, what makes an organism at one time identical to an organism at a later time is the fact that each of those two is caught up in one and the same life process. And so long as that same biological event, that same life continues, then one and the same object they hold continues in existence. It persists. So if Keith, in December of 2004, when I got married, is caught up in one life, but Keith in March of 2018 is caught up in a different life, then we are not talking about numerically identical Keiths. So if you're thinking ahead of me, you've probably realized this. The big question for the animalist view is whether the various activities comprising the life process can, in fact, continue over time. If it cannot, then this is a hopeless explanation. There won't be any persistence conditions. But if it can, maybe they're onto something. So my friend Brandon Rickabaugh is a very sharp philosopher at Baylor. He talks about this view and he says the following: a life is an event composed of a collection of separate relation instances and atomic parts. And as your parts are replaced, so are the relation instances. So because of this inherent process, a life at one moment, call it time 1, is not numerically identical to a life at a later moment, call it T2. Although the relation types and the part types may remain, the specific relation tokens and part tokens are expelled and they are replaced constantly. That is to say, the life at the later time, T2, might have all the same type of structure and the same type of parts as the life at T1, although the life at T2 does not have numerically identical structures or the numerically identical parts as the life at T1. So he sums up his quote this way at the end of his quote. He says, "The life just is this sort of storm of parts and relational instances. It isn't as if there is some fundamental thing that has separable parts and relation instances. A life just is this storm on the animalist view, this collection of parts and the relation of those parts. But the result of this is that a life cannot endure, that one process can't continue. It would have to be a brand new process at every moment because of the new tokens that are involved in the process. So what this means, the upshot is this, that according to animalism, the life of Keith in December 2004 involves biological relations that are of the same type as the life of Keith in 2018, along with similar type of biological stuff, but the particular tokens that belong to the life of Keith in 2004 are absolutely not identical to the tokens of the life that belongs to Keith or the life that comprises Keith in 2018. In other words, there is no persistence of one and the same Keith. Okay. How does all this connect to Christian doctrine? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we got a few minutes to tell you. Christians traditionally are committed to the belief in, for example, a post-mortem intermediate state and the bodily resurrection of the dead. And although these are theologically rich doctrines, there's a lot to say. They involve a whole lot more than the continuance of existence. For our purposes, we're only interested in that one angle on these doctrines. So what does it take to have a correct, biblically, a view of these doctrines that's in fidelity to the teaching of Scripture? Well, it takes at least three things. First, the person, numerically one and the same person, first exists as a physically embodied being, say at a time 1. So we can say at this moment, because here you all are doing that. 2, that following physical death, this person exists as disembodied from that moment until a later moment. And then finally, following that later moment, bodily resurrection exists. Thereafter, you exist as embodied, now with your glorified body. So your resurrection body is numerically identical to your premortem body. That's right, you're getting this very body back, only redeemed from the nasty effects of sin, and we call it your glorified body. I hope that's good news for you. So traditionally it's held that one's resurrection body is numerically identical. We see this in the instance of Christ, for example. Think back to like 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 through about 49. So this does not mean that your resurrection body has the same physical or microphysical parts as your premortem body. It doesn't have to mean that. Your premortem body is numerically identical with itself over time, but it doesn't share the same physical or microphysical parts over time. So there's no reason to think that your resurrection body will share those same parts as with your current body. But given their deep roots in the Christian tradition, we should be very reluctant to abandon the belief in intermediate state and the resurrection of the body. So here's what I suggest, that if your anthropology cannot account for a belief in an intermediate state and a physical bodily resurrection, then your ontology of persons is not, to that extent, compatible with the Christian faith. That's a polite version of that. But Christian physicalists cannot affirm that following physical death, a person exists in a disembodied form in any literal sense. Because once your physical body dies, you are done, on their view. So Nancy Murphy acknowledges this. She says in her book that, quote, all that physicalist anthropology strictly requires are one or two adjustments. One needs to give up or finesse the doctrine of the intermediate state, if that has been an important part of one's tradition. But from the quotes at the beginning of this talk, that's been there since Augustine at least. It can be finessed by calling into question the meaningfulness of putting the experiences of those who are with God on an earthly timeline. One needs also to understand resurrection differently. Not reclothing of a naked soul, as Paul says in the second letter to the Corinthians, but rather restoring the whole person to life, a new transformed kind of life. Okay, so setting aside the red herrings of her mentioning sort of putting believers who are in the intermediate state on an earthly timeline, I'm not sure what she's talking about there, and setting aside the implications of what she's saying, what we're keenly interested in is what sort of adjustments to the traditional views of the Christian tradition are we talking about here. Whatever adjustments she offers, it's important to just realize what's happening. They're being offered as revisions of the traditional Christian view. Okay, theologian John Cooper is surely correct when he concludes that if it is false that the soul, that is the essential person or self, if it's false that that person can survive separation from the body, if human beings are monistic or ontologically holistic beings, then this eschatological scenario, the traditional Christian view I just described, is a flat impossibility, and I think he's right about that. But Christian physicalists do tend to view the doctrine of the resurrection as a test case for their view, interestingly enough. I'm going to skip down a little bit so I can reserve a few minutes for time here. The gist is that if you're committed to a view of human beings that will not allow for the numerical existence or the persistence conditions of one person at point 1 being numerically identical to the person at point 2, then it cannot be that the person who dies at point 1 is numerically identical to the person who is resurrected at point 2. That's the upshot of the bit that I'm going to skip over here. Okay. If we can't preserve numerical identity, then none of the people, think about this, none of the people who will populate the eschatological state, the hereafter, will be redeemed sinners. Does it strike you as odd? The whole point of heaven is that it's populated by people who were sinners, but who are redeemed sinners. Indeed, a denial of this would seem to controvert the Christian hope of salvation. So in that, for example, the Keith who accepts Christ as his Savior in 1988 would cease existing at physical death and would be replaced by a qualitatively similar, but nevertheless not numerically identical, Keith who has a resurrection body and enjoys the final state with God. And that Keith has never committed a sin in his life. And the Keith who accepted Christ no longer exists. That seems like a problem to me. So if this kind of conclusion is to be avoided, the constitutionalist must explain how Keith who accepts Christ as his Savior in 1988's first-person perspective continues to be exemplified between his ceasing to be constituted by his physical body and his coming to be constituted by his resurrection body. And by the way, Lynn Rudder-Baker, to her credit, has thought about this and realizes this is a problem on her view, but here's her response. Her suggestion is that, quote, there is no intermediate state, but that Keith temporarily does not exist in the interim, close quote. Sort of seems to me to give away the game there. She claims that at the resurrection, quote, God reassembles the atoms that constituted Keith and restores the relationships that they bore to one another during Keith's natural life, and thereby, her word, recreates Keith. So during the time that Keith does not exist, some of his atoms still do, and they provide the basis for his resurrection body to be a continuant of his biological body. But I'm afraid it's too late at that point. She already gave away the game. So these kinds of reinterpretations of the Christian understanding are the only way to salvage these non-reductive physicalist views of a person. Certainly in my view of how theology works, we ought to begin with not only what we know via common sense, but what theology requires, and use that as sort of a policing mechanism for what sort of philosophy on the ontology of persons we are willing to accept. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'll leave us about 11 minutes for questions because I'm sure there's probably going to be a few. Okay, great. So Christian physicalism is a bad idea. That's the big idea. Questions for you guys. Let's hear it. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, let's talk about it. That was a lot to take in really fast, I know. But I mean, you signed up for the advanced track, so, or at least tomorrow you'll perhaps sign up for the advanced track. We'll see.
Are there any conservatives besides, or I know Nancy Murphy, she's not a conservative, right?
Who?
Nancy Murphy.
Oh, you know, conservative's a weird term. It usually means, you know, a person who agrees with me, and a liberal usually is a person who disagrees with me. But I don't agree with Nancy Murphy, so I'm going to say she's a liberal. How's that? She may say the opposite. I don't know. Are there you wondering about who other people who are Christian physicalists?
Yeah, is there a conservative?
Yeah, there's actually there's a pretty, it's a growing group. That's why I'm concerned enough about it to bring it before your attention here. If you guys just pop into Google later, you know, while you're driving home, that's a joke, don't do that. Christian physicalists, I mean, there's loads of them. And the folks that I listed tonight, Nancy Murphy, Kevin Corcoran, Lynn Rudder-Baker, I'm slipping here, Peter Van Inwagen, Trenton Merricks, these are not obscure fly-by-night scholars. All 5 of those folks are enormously influential, very influential in the field. There are lots of other Christian physicalists who are less recognizable than them, but those are probably, you think of any other big boy names there in that group, that's probably the big five, yeah. There, could name others. I mean, Joel Green is a New Testament scholar. Warren Brown is a neuroscientist who is a Christian physicalist. Who does Warren Brown always write with? They write everything together. I can't remember. It's like Neuroscience and the Soul is their book. Warren S. Brown is his like academic credential. You'll find him out of that. But yeah, there's a lot. Yes, Jake.
Isn't non-reductive physicalism kind of going out of vogue amongst at least atheistic physicalists? And if so, aren't Christians kind of late to the bandwagon?
That's a great question. So Christian physicalists have good reasons not to get on board with reductive physicalism because it would seem to just make straightforwardly impossible most of what we hold metaphysically. And so for that reason, to my knowledge, and I checked around because I don't know a lot of things, and no one I knew, including the real expert, this guy who can go to his talk tomorrow, none of us could think of a single Christian reductive physicalist. Amongst non-Christian physicalists, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm in a very good position to really count noses, but non-reductive physicalism is not on its way out. It's very popular right now. In particular, the two versions of it that we talked about tonight. I dare say that animalism is overtaking the Constitution view as the most popular, especially because of the enormously influential work of, where's Eric Olson? Starts with an S in England. I'm slipping here. It's past my bedtime, by the way. I have a 1.5-year-old. I'm usually in bed at 9 o'clock. But Eric Olson is like Mr. Animalist, and he is making converts left and right. So no, I don't think that it's quite right to say that non-reductive physicalism is on its way out and the Christian physicalists are going to be left holding the bag. No, I don't think so. No. Yes, sir.
So folks like Nancy Murphy who have the constitutionalist point of view, is that correct?
Yes.
So my question would be about Romans 5:12.
Mm-hmm.
Believe that the inherent sin is a genetic issue passed on through DNA.
That's a great point. To my knowledge, there is only in existence one article that has addressed that issue from a non-reductive physicalist perspective, and it takes that explanation. I mean, because if you're a Christian physicalist, it's kind of a layup to say, well, how do you explain original sin? Well, here you go. It's passed on genetically. And they happily point to the traditional Reformed view as uncomfortable but nevertheless real allies in explaining it that way. Yeah.
Now they're entering science and having to...
Well, yeah, I read a lot of quotes, and so you guys didn't have them before you, but one of her quotes was to the effect that neuroscience is totally supplanting metaphysics for just about every theologically relevant explanation. Yeah. Was it you? Yeah.
So what would the Constitution do with people who have mental handicaps and can't think of themselves in a first person perspective?
Boy, that's a great question. That's a really tough one. I think that's there is much fruit to be had in that avenue of attacking the constitutionalists. I can't think how, if I were a constitutionalist, I would be able to, because they wouldn't be able to point to just the capacity for a first-person perspective. You actually have to have the first-person perspective. I think that there could be a lot of end-of-life, a lot of ethical problems there. Yeah, you should write an article. Write it and let's publish it together. Yes?
So how does a Christian physicalist view the incarnation, especially from the view of like Philippians 2?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In this case, good news, if you're really keen to dig into it, there's actually a lot written by the Christian physicalists on this front. Probably Trenton Merrick's is going to be your guy here. He's not a constitutionalist, but he has written the most, I think, in trying to defend physicalist Christology. He has, I might be able to tell you exactly. He has a chapter in a book the book's called Reason for the Hope Within, edited by Michael Murray. And his chapter is called The Resurrection of Body and the Life Everlasting. So that's from the late 90s, and he's feeling his way into the view. Then I don't have the years here, but he has an article called, I just lost it. How to Live Forever Without Losing Your Soul. No, How to Live Forever Without Saving Your Soul. Physicalism and Immortality. That's in Kevin Corcoran's edited book. I think, is that the one where, yeah, I think that's the one where Merrick lays out his view. But I mean, he will say the same thing about Christ that he says about every other human person. I mean, he's on board with commitment to the belief that Jesus is truly a human, just like us, sin accepted. And he will explain that he holds there's no such thing as the persistence conditions over time. He thinks that there is such thing as identity over time, but there's no such thing as conditions for explaining or accounting for it. And that's in a famous article he wrote called "There Are No Criteria for Identity Over Time." So the title kind of gave away the point there. But yeah, I mean, he won't say anything about Christ that we didn't say about the animalist view, that we didn't already point out that animalist view says about other persons. But if you're just really curious to dig in it, he's something called the falling elevator model that you'll want to just look into. Yeah, that's the short version of that question. Yeah.
How do Christian physicalists explain the use of the word soul in Scripture?
Yeah, that's a great question, because inasmuch as they're Christians, they do want to remain as faithful as possible to the Bible. So typically, they will just say things like, when we use the word soul, well, I'll give you an example. We say things like this using the word heart all the time. I tell my wife, love you with all of my heart. Well, it's a kind of an odd thing to say if you were to think about it. Because my heart is just an organ that pumps blood. I mean, it doesn't think. So they will say that it's similar to that's talk of mind or soul, whether in the Bible or elsewhere, is sort of metaphorical talk for brain function or the brain itself. Yeah. So maybe it's just a literary flourish. And the Bible is not a philosophy textbook after all. They're right about that. And so they say, well, it's just the Bible expressing things literarily that if we push on them philosophically would boil down to brain talk. Yeah, that's a great question, though. Yeah.
It seems like Christian physicalists are trying to unite sort of neuroscience and Christianity in the same way that theistic evolutionists are trying to blend science and nature. So I'm curious, what is the appeal? Is it just to stay relevant within scientific literature?
Hey, come back here. I don't, we're not in a position to know their personal motivations as opposed to their academic motivations. I don't want to just say that you're just saying that so you can stay relevant, publish books and stuff, because these are people of integrity. I mean, I think that they're just trying to follow where they really believe that the best arguments and the best evidence points them. From the early quotes, you can see that's evident. They have a extraordinarily high regard for scientific data, and so each of them are really smitten with the neurosciences. And so I think that if they were here and could answer this question themselves, they would say that, look, science is telling us for sure that these things are the case, and so we feel we have no recourse but to consider how we can mold them with Christian doctrine. Because if you're convinced that this is genuine knowledge from over here, and this is genuine knowledge from over here, but they look like they're incompatible, then you'd say your job is to figure out how to make them mesh. And I think that's probably what they're up to. They're just trying to bring together what they believe is on. So my talk has been aimed at saying, well, yeah, this stuff's real knowledge, this theology stuff, but you're just mistaken about the truth status of these claims. So yeah, that's my view. There's probably somebody out there who thinks this thing's just to be popular and cool, but I don't want to foist that on the...
Well, it's more or less meaning like with, they obviously see some value to it. So not
Yeah.
necessarily to stay relevant and pull
Yeah.
popular sell books, that sort of thing. But it just seems like
Yeah.
it's favoring empirical.
Oh, yeah,
evidence over
definitely so.
the biblical.
Yeah, they are... and what I think you're right about that, Amy, but I just want to follow it up with a quick clarifier. It's not the case that there is straightforward physical evidence, or empirical evidence, as you put it, that some version of physicalism is true. I mean, there is an enormous literature on brain studies, and studies about brain waves, and what part of your brain lights up when this happens and that happens, and so that we can predict which part's going to light up when you say, we show you cotton candy or something. Not all of my brain. But what there tends to be in the scientific literature that's relevant to this discussion is a leap from, it is the case that X, to therefore it must be the case that Y. It's the interpretive step where I think some sort of slippery work is being done there. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
How would they define their relationship with Christ?
Oh, well, I have heard them talk about it. I have heard all but, I never heard Lynn Rudder-Baker. She passed actually just before a conference I was going to hear at, and I've never heard Peter Van Inwagen, but I've read his testimony, and so can you, in a book called Philosophers Who Believe. And to an individual, they will tell you the same thing that I would tell you. They believe that they are sinners, that they stand in need of the forgiveness that's only available through the shed blood of Christ. Otherwise, there's no reconciliation with the Father. They absolutely will tell you that is their basis for faith. Yeah, that's the basis on which they claim to be Christians. Yeah.
But they don't have an ongoing relationship with
I think they do, actually. I think they do. Yep, I mean, none of us are in a position to read the minds of another person, but I have no reason to doubt their claims to having a thriving devotional life. I mean, I can attest that Trenton Merricks knows the Bible frontwards and backwards, probably better than most of us. So it's not like you're such a severe sinner, that must be why you're a Christian physicalist. I don't think it's that kind of situation. I think that they're genuine believers who are just really wrong about the nature of human persons. Yeah.
I see a difficulty having a relationship when you don't agree with resurrection.
Well, yeah, see, though, that's the tricky thing. They do believe in resurrection, but I'm trying to argue that they hold a view of human persons that undercuts their view of resurrection. So I don't know if it's like cognitive dissonance or something, but I don't think I'm in any position to doubt the genuineness of their belief in these things. So, okay, gang, we're 3 minutes over. I'm kind of watching Dr. Gould in the reflection, and he's still going strong. Okay, nope, I see it. There it is. Time for me to tell you the announcement. I mean, I can't lose to Dr. Gould, let's face it. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I wish I could promise you like a huge buffet of all your favorite foods beforehand, but you know what? We're not rich, but we've got plenty of good talks to offer you. So starting at 9 o'clock in the morning in room 237, you can write this on the back of your thing if you want somehow the room numbers, you can make it. Mr. Alan Hainline is going to talk about cosmic so-called coincidences in room 237, which I think is this room. In room 239 next door, Corey Miller, the president of Ratio Christi, will talk about leaving Mormonism, which is his experience, by the way. And then in the big room downstairs, Tim McGrew, our other keynote speaker, will tell you all about how to think about miracles, and if you're lucky, he might perform one. So come back at 9 o'clock. Don't miss it. Thanks for your attentiveness. See you tomorrow.